In the heart of West Virginia, there stands a sprawling Gothic edifice of masonry and mansard roofs, an imposing monument to 19th century optimism that turned into a 20th century nightmare. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, later known as Weston State Hospital, conceived as a sanctuary of healing, but became infamous as a byword for the grim realities of institutional mental health care. And so imagine yourself, right there, walking through the dim corridors, stretching nearly a quarter mile. You pass by hundreds of heavy wooden doors, knowing that for over a century, these halls witness both the highest hopes of reformers and the darkest abuses dished out to the forgotten. Let's just look at one rather chilling discovery made one quiet evening in the 1980s. A nurse who had vanished from her post was finally found, her decomposed body lying at the bottom of an unused staircase, and of a silent victim of the very patients she tried to help. And this is just one of the many tragic tales that are sealed within the asylum's walls. So today, we go back all the way from the 1850s to our modern era, and we can explore those halls of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I think by the end we'll have a deeper understanding that just like all of the other mental health hospitals in the United States at the time, it's just another story of how wrong things can go. But let me welcome you to the channel first. Hello there, if you're a newcomer, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I invite you to hit that subscribe button and check out the playlist for more. Now, speaking of which, you can enjoy this and all of the other videos completely ad-free right here on YouTube. You won't get any interruptions. You won't be waken up or startled by some advertisement. None of that on this channel. It's pretty good, right? Well, that's because we are supported by our members on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who check out the merch store, and also the occasional donation. All of the links are available in the pinned comment and video description. But short of that, just like, subscribe, leave a comment, and tell your friends. That's good enough for us. Thank you for your support, and let's begin. So, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, like the others born out of this mid-19th century movement to reform the care of the mentally ill, if you've watched the other videos in this series, then you'll understand the general climate of the time. But prior to this era, individuals with mental illnesses in the United States often endured quite deplorable conditions, jailed up with criminals, chained in cellars, left to languish without any treatment, just shoved into a corner, not to be seen or heard. Of course, we have a leading voice for change. That was Dorothy Deese, a tireless crusader who in the 1840s had exposed the horrific conditions of the insane in jails and almshouses. In her famous 1843 memorial to the Massachusetts legislature, Deese described the, quote, cold and damp cells and abused patients she had witnessed, and this galvanized lawmakers to create proper asylums. Her advocacy helped spark the establishment of state mental hospitals across the country, including Virginia, which at the time encompassed present-day West Virginia. And against this backdrop of reform, the Virginia General Assembly in 1858 authorized a new state-of-the-art psychiatric hospital to serve the western part of the state. The project was inspired by the influential ideas of Thomas Story Kirkbride, a prominent psychiatrist and asylum superintendent. Now, as for Kirkbride, he believed that environment was integral to treatment. A bit of a new idea at the time. It turns out that locking people in dungeons actually is not good for one's mental health. Who would have thought? Once again, modern ideas coming into play. Well, in 1854, he published a treatise prescribing the design of mental hospitals. He called for large, orderly facilities with long wings, arranged to allow sunlight and fresh air into every room. And he envisioned therapeutic gardens, along with productive activities for all patients, all part of what he termed moral treatment. It sounds like a big improvement, that's for sure. And it was pretty radical for the time. Well, after all, no one was really looking at the mentally ill as criminals. And if someone was mentally ill and unstable, it's best that they get put into a place where they can be looked after before any kind of trouble comes to themselves or others. So with all of this in mind, everybody was quite on board with the plan. And the Trans-Allegheny Asylum was planned according to this Kirkbride idealism. The renowned Baltimore architect Richard Snowden Andrews drew up an elaborate Gothic revival structure of a staggering scale. A central administration building crowned with a 200-foot clock tower, flanked by wings that would actually make it the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America, and second only in the world, by the way, to the Kremlin. The asylum's foundation stone was laid in 1858 on a 269-acre farm just outside the town of Weston, nestled beyond the Allegheny Mountains. Construction was soon interrupted by the chaos of the American Civil War from 1861 to 65. And in June 1861, as Virginia succeeded to join the Confederacy, a Union regiment swept into Weston on a surprise mission. Well, this was not to seize the asylum, of course, which was still only partially built, but to confiscate a cache of gold intended to pay for the construction workers. The 7th Ohio Infantry, led by Colonel Erastus B. Tyler, marched overnight to Weston and seized approximately $27,000 of the day's money in gold from a local bank that was earmarked for the asylum's payroll. The Union forces managed to send the gold to Wheeling, where it helped finance pro-Union government of Western Virginia. Now, this is a pretty dramatic episode, and it meant that the funds for the asylum stayed in Union hands. When West Virginia was formed as a separate Union-aligned state in 1863, one of its first priorities was to finish the hospital. And despite intermittent occupations of the construction site by soldiers and raids that stripped the building material, work resumed before the war ended. But the turmoil of the war thus oddly ensured the asylum's completion. After 1875, an economically unscathed Weston benefited from the state investments pouring into the large building project. By late 1864, even as construction continued, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum opened its doors to its first patients. The very first admission came in October 1864, and was a housewife from Ohio, described simply as suffering from domestic trouble, whatever that means. But you see, in that era, the grounds for committing someone to an asylum were astonishingly broad. The asylum's own early logbooks reveal admissions for causes that today seem baffling or outright unjust. Among a few of the recorded reasons were grief, feebleness of intellect, religious enthusiasm, novel reading, I know, right? Menstrual derangement, and of course, masturbation. They'd lock you up for anything, won't they? Now, in one case, a man was sent to the asylum for seduction and disappointment, implying that his romantic entanglement had gone wrong. And believe it or not, even laziness and egotism were listed as causes for insanity in various 19th century records. But clearly the facility was not only for those with severe mental illnesses as we define it today. It became a repository for society's undesirables, anyone deemed inconveniently different. And as one scholar later noted, These institutions often functioned as a dumping ground for people who simply didn't fit the mold of the social norms of the time. Yet in its early years, the atmosphere of the new asylum may have been relatively hopeful, at least by the standards of the day. The hospital was designed to be largely self-sufficient, reflecting the 19th century ideal that patients would benefit from a productive routine. And of course, the old saying is certainly true, the devil makes work for idle hands. And I tell you, in the times where I have nothing to do, I really have to find something to do. Otherwise, yeah. Without any direction, you just spin around in circles, don't you? In any case, the hospital was designed to be largely self-sufficient, as we said, and the sprawling campus eventually expanded to over 600 acres of land. Remember, originally it was 269, so this is more than doubling. Patients grew vegetables on the asylum's farm, tended to a cow herd for milk and dairy products, and even made furniture and clothing on site. The complex had its own blacksmith and even a carpentry shop. It included a waterworks, an ice plant, and later a gas well for light, all intended to support a community isolated from the outside world. And this self-contained operation served a dual purpose, you see, giving patients occupational therapy in the form of work, and also providing the institution with food and supplies. Early accounts suggest some patients experienced a structured, even dignified daily life as they engaged in farming, cooking, sewing, and maintenance tasks, under the notion that busy hands and fresh air could help calm a troubled mind. Dr. Rufus Haymond, the first superintendent in 1863, and his staff implemented the moral treatment principles. They did away with the chains and restraints where possible, provided recreational activities, and maintained a neat environment. Male and female patients were separated into different wards, and each patient had a private room with tall windows to let in sunshine. In the center building, there were comfortable parlors, and even a grand ballroom under the clock tower dome, intended for patient dances and socialization. A local reporter visiting in the 1870s, a little bit of a jump ahead, I know, described seeing patients strolling the landscape grounds, reading in the library, attending chapel on Sundays, certainly images that suggested a genteel asylum life, at least on the surface. But problems began to mount almost immediately. The asylum had been designed to accommodate about 250 patients at a maximum, based on Kirkbride's recommendation that no superintendent could humanely manage more than that number. But demand quickly exceeded that capacity. West Virginia in the late 19th century was still a rugged rural state, and the new hospital in Weston was one of the few places to send anyone deemed mentally ill, or even those simply unwanted by their families. So by 1870, only 6 years after the official opening, the patient census had crossed 300. The original construction dragged on through the 1870s. The central administration section with its imposing clock tower was finally finished in 1871, and a separate, segregated wing for black patients was added in 1873 to comply with the racial segregation laws of the time. When the massive building was finally declared complete in 1881, after a construction cost of $725,000, far above the initial budget, by the way, it was already overflowing. Over 700 patients were living there by that year. Now, this number was nearly 3 times the intended capacity, and the asylum had to crowd multiple patients into rooms that were originally designed for one. Already in the 1880s, legislative committees were warning of the dangers of overcrowding at Weston. As for the hospital leadership, they continually appealed for funds to expand and improve the facilities. And in response, the state added more structures, a new wing or annex here, a separate recovery ward, and so on. In 1890, a separate woman's auxiliary building was erected to house female convalescent patients, and by 1892, the open front lawn was enclosed with an ornate wrought iron fence. But despite these efforts, every new space was filled almost as soon as it opened. The reasons patients were sent in only grew to be more eclectic. It ranged from tuberculosis, a physical illness, but some chronically ill ended up in asylums for lack of other hospitals, and you certainly don't want to be in the same room as a tuberculosis patient, all the way to hysteria, also called female troubles, which was, well, basically any behavior in women that defied their husband's wishes. A contemporary list of causes for female patients included heartbreaking labels like imaginary female trouble and menopause, suggesting women could be put away for any normal life stages or just resisting an oppressive situation. Indeed, one early female patient had been committed simply for ill treatment by husband, meaning that her husband actually abused her, yet she was institutionalized and the husband remained free. Well, by the turn of the century, the asylum was wrestling not only with numbers, but also with a shift in mission. Initially conceived as a place to cure and release patients back to society, it increasingly became a custodial institution, a long-term storage for the chronically ill or the socially unwanted. Superintendents found themselves with swelling populations of patients who never left, and many spent decades or entire lifetimes within Weston's walls. As the 19th century came to a close, dozens of indignant patients who died were buried in the asylum's own cemetery, on a lonely hillside of the grounds. And most graves were actually not marked with names, but numbers, another indicator that these people died without families to claim them. By 1899, an observer could already detect a sense of strain. The noble ideals of moral therapy had faded under the sheer pressure of housing and managing so many souls. But not everything was bleak in those early days. You have to recall the context of the time. I mean, compared to jails and attics the mentally ill had known before, Weston's asylum likely did offer better shelter, at least comparatively. Not good, but better. And then there was the routine meals, and some semblance of care. There were even moments of community. Patient baseball games, holiday dances, and craft workshops are recorded in hospital reports around the 1890s. But ominous signs of neglect were present, with staffing levels increasingly inadequate relative to patients. Individualized attention waned. Restraints began to come back into vogue, used more frequently to maintain order. Seclusion cells, bare rooms to isolate unruly patients, became a common tool, despite Kirkbride's original rejection of such harsh methods. Literally just a step back now. In truth, the asylum's outward orderliness was masking an internal reality, that the institution was filling up beyond its means, and the cracks in its humane facade were now beginning to show. So by 1900, the asylum had far outgrown what its founders had ever envisioned. The early 20th century saw a continued surge in patient numbers as West Virginia's population grew, and also as social attitudes cast a wide net over who should be institutionalized. The philosophy of care also shifted during this period. The progressive optimism of the Kirkbride era gave way to a more pessimistic and custodial approach. Many in the psychiatric field began to believe that certain mental illnesses were incurable, and that the asylum's role was more to segregate and manage rather than rehabilitate. At Weston, this meant fewer resources devoted to therapies or recreation, and more emphasis on maintenance and control. The census figures tell a pretty stark story about that. In 1902, the hospital drilled its own natural gas well on the grounds to fuel new heating and lighting systems, a response to the growing operational needs of the expanding complex. By 1905, the patient population was reported around 1,000, and it kept climbing. Every available building on the property was converted to a dormitory. Former single-person rooms were double-bunked and then triple-bunked. Over the 1910s and 20s, West Virginia's legislature authorized further additions: an infectious diseases unit dedicated to tuberculosis buildings, and a separate cottage for geriatric patients, and for the criminally insane. But these additions never really solved that fundamental imbalance. As soon as they opened, they were filled and then overfilled. Administrators struggled with chronic underfunding from the state. Annual reports from the 1910s and 20s are filled with pleas for more nurses, more attendants, more money for food and bedding. The State Board of Control, which oversaw West Virginia's asylums, acknowledged in a 1928 report that Weston Hospital had to divert part of its budget just to feed the overflow of patients not originally budgeted for. Well, there were stories of shortages, patients having to share soiled mattresses or wear cast-off clothing, that kind of thing, donated by local charities. Sanitary conditions deteriorated as the housekeeping staff could not keep up, and that was a problem that would only get worse in the ensuing decades. Now, some attempts at treatment did continue during this period, but often these appeared, misguided or cruel in hindsight. The hydrotherapy craze of the 1910s had reached Weston, and do remember, it has been renamed Weston State Hospital in 1913, so a bit of a nicer name than Lunatic Asylum. So this hydrotherapy craze, it meant that agitated patients might be subjected to hour-long baths in tubs of ice-cold water or wrapped in wet sheets. Believe it or not, this was a treatment meant to soothe, but, if you're thinking it sounds like torture, it's because it pretty much is. And then we had the early use of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, that began in the late 1930s at Weston as a remedy for severe depression or psychosis. And at that time, ECT was administered without any anesthesia or muscle relaxants, making it a terrifying ordeal of convulsions and pain. A picture of Weston State Hospital's condition emerges from an external survey conducted in 1938 by a committee of the American Psychiatric Association and other bodies. This national survey visited mental hospitals across the country. At Weston, the survey has found 1,661 patients crammed into facilities intended for far fewer. The report noted that among these patients were not only those with psychiatric illnesses, but also people with epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, which at the time was termed mental defectiveness, and others who today would not be in a psychiatric hospital at all. In other words, Weston had become a catch-all warehouse for the various marginalized groups. The physical plant was described as a dilapidated and unsanitary building in parts. One contemporary newspaper account from the year described peeling paint, foul odors, and unwashed inmates dressed in rags. And tragedy struck, too, as a direct consequence of patient unrest in October of 1935, when a disturbed patient set fire to one of the wards. Flames gutted a large section of the fourth floor of the main building before firefighters extinguished the blaze. But believe it or not, no lives were lost in that inferno. But it certainly did highlight the volatility of housing so many people in close quarters. The damaged wing was rebuilt in 1938 with funding from the New Deal's Works Progress Administration at a cost of $155,000. Interestingly, that rebuilt wing became one of the nicest parts of the hospital. In the late 1940s, staff referred to it wryly as the luxury ward. It had new beds, better lighting, and it even had paintings on the walls. Not like the other wings. But of course, only a small fraction of patients could enjoy these improved quarters. By the end of the 1930s, local newspapers had begun to take notice of Weston's deplorable conditions, breaking a long public silence. In 1939, an investigative series in the Charleston Gazette exposed alarming conditions at both Weston and the other asylums in the state. The Gazette articles described patients sleeping on the floor and insufficient furniture, lighting, and heating throughout much of the hospital's quarters. Photos that ran with the newspaper story showed filthy day rooms with broken windows and patients huddled in tattered clothing. And these revelations certainly started to chip away at that genteel myth that had surrounded the asylum. For the first time, the public glimpsed Weston not as a therapeutic refuge, but as an overcrowded and underfunded institution, teetering on the edge of complete chaos. And so we find ourselves in the 1940s, where we are in a new and even darker chapter. Two contrasting trends define this era. On one hand, the patient population reached its absolute peak, and on the other, a wave of new radical treatments, some would say torturous human experiments, were introduced in an attempt to manage the overcrowding and improve patient outcomes. The period was categorized by both increasing violence within the wards and an aggressive medical intervention that remains controversial to this day, that of course being the lobotomy. During the Second World War and its aftermath, the census at Weston climbed to unprecedented levels. In 1949, the hospital housed approximately 1,800 patients, an unimaginable figure for a facility built for 250 of them. A staff member in 1950 recounted that every corridor had beds lining the walls at night. Sometimes the overflow of chronic patients slept on the mattresses directly on the floor. It was essentially 10 times over capacity by the early 50s. The staff-to-patient ratio was also abysmal. A single nurse might be in charge of over 50 patients in a ward, assisted by just a couple of orderlies. And under such conditions, individualized care was virtually non-existent. The hospital superintendent at mid-century, Dr. J.C. Stanley, openly admitted that his role had become more about crowd control than cure. Desperate to reduce patient numbers and calm the wards, West Virginia officials turned to the drastic measure of lobotomy. In the early 50s, the state's mental health system invited the notorious neurologist Dr. Walter Freeman to launch what was called the West Virginia Lobotomy Project. Freeman was the foremost American advocate of the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure where a sharp instrument akin to an ice pick was inserted through the patient's eye socket and swung to sever connections in the frontal lobe of the brain. I can see you rubbing your eye now just at the thought of it. Terrible, isn't it? Especially just the use of that term, ice pick. It's as frightening enough as it is, but just adding that terminology just makes it even more grim, I think. In any case, Freeman promised that this quick and easy surgery could pacify intractably ill patients and perhaps even send some home cured. Well, in truth, it did often leave patients docile, but they were just cognitively and emotionally devastated, essentially a chemical restraint by surgical means. He would turn them into effectively vegetables. Well, starting in the summer of 1952, Dr. Freeman made multiple trips to Weston State Hospital. armed with his silver ice pick, which he called an orbiter-classed, a carpenter's mallet. Freeman went ward to ward, sometimes performing dozens of lobotomies in a single day. Astonishingly, records show that between 1952 and 55, around 900 lobotomies were performed at West Virginia's asylums, with Weston being a major site of them. In one 2-week period in 1952, Freeman himself performed 228 lobotomies in West Virginia, an intensive blitz that he actually nicknamed Operation Ice Pick. It's ironic because it just seems like such madness, doesn't it? It seems like that Dr. Freeman should be the one locked up for being insane. Hindsight. All in hindsight, isn't it? Well, many of those surgeries took place at Weston, those 228 Operation Ice Pick procedures. Patients, some of them very young, some not even clearly diagnosed, were rendered unconscious with electroshock and then lobotomized in an assembly line fashion. Patient after patient, eyelid retracted, lined up against the wall, the leucotome punching through the thin orbital bone with a hammer's tap. A few crude swipes to disrupt the brain tissue, and then just on to the next one. Family members were often not even consulted or informed beforehand. Consent standards were lax to non-existent. In many cases, the state was the guardian for these long-term inmates and simply ordered the procedures. While a handful of families later reported their relatives seemed calmer or happier after lobotomy, far more outcomes were tragic. Well, some patients emerged with seizures or loss of the ability to speak coherently. Others were reduced to a childlike state, lacking initiative or recognition of their loved ones. Freeman famously considered any lobotomy that did not result in death as a roaring success. But at Weston, at least a few patients did die from the procedure, shortly after from cerebral hemorrhages or perhaps infections. Nonetheless, administrators initially hailed lobotomy as a miracle. It did, granted, make previously aggressive patients quite compliant and easier to manage, and each patient, sent home even in a diminished state, was one less body occupying a bed, and that was the main concern, really. But in parallel with lobotomy, the 40s also saw continued use of other brutal therapies. Insulin coma therapy was introduced for schizophrenic patients. Large doses of insulin were injected into the body to induce daily comas, under the ill-founded hope that repeatedly shocking the brain with low blood sugar could reset mental illness. I don't know how they came to that, but that's just what they thought. Patients would convulse and sometimes lapse into prolonged comas or die. The risks were high, of course. And yet, at Weston, as in many asylums, insulin coma treatment was standard in the 40s for a time. Metrazole convulsive therapy was another. A chemical called metrazole was injected to trigger violent seizures. The theory was that induced seizures might cure schizophrenia. Patients often broke bones during metrazole convulsions. A truly terrifying experience, described by one as feeling your body on fire and being sure that you were dying, as later recounted in a patient memoir from another hospital, but reflective of such treatment in general. By the early 1950s, electroconvulsive therapy had largely replaced metrazole. But even ECT at the time without anesthesia was agonizing and could result in fractured vertebrae. Well, the cumulative effect of these therapies was a deepening atmosphere of dread within the asylum. Many patients lived in fear of being the next one on the list for a shock treatment or the lobotomy table. One can argue that doctors and staff were not malevolent, of course, They were simply overwhelmed caregivers grasping at any straw that promised relief for patients or manageability of the wards. And indeed, a few severely ill individuals did quiet down and could be discharged after these interventions, which at the time on paper was seen as a success. But of course, with hindsight, it's clear that patients often endured torture in the name of treatment. Meanwhile, the basic conditions of daily life remained as bad as ever, if not worse. Food was pretty meager, and when you got it, it was poor quality. Budgeting for meals only amounted to about a few cents per patient per day in the 1940s. And then there was the sanitation. Oh, that was appalling too. A 1949 Charleston Gazette reporter described some wards where, quote, "the stench of urine and feces is overpowering," and noted that a number of patients lacked even a bed or a mattress, just sleeping directly on the concrete floor. As for the winter time, heating failed, leaving patients huddling together in frayed blankets for warmth. The best-kept parts of the hospital were often reserved for the quieter, more presentable patients, those in the honor ward, or the ones put to work sewing and cooking. But many others, especially the profoundly disturbed or disabled, were regulated to back wards, where the conditions were truly hellish. In these neglected corners, violence among the patients became a frequent occurrence. With minimal supervision, overstretched attendants couldn't watch everyone. Stronger patients sometimes preyed on the weaker ones. Anecdotal accounts and later investigations documented episodes of assault, including SA. And all of these just went unchecked. During this era, several patient-on-patient murders occurred at Weston too. One famous incident often retold in whispers by staff was the so-called bedpost murder. Sometimes in the early 1950s, some sources place it later, in the early 80s, but former employees recall an earlier origin to the tale. Two violently psychotic patients conspired to kill a third patient in a most gruesome way. They initially tried to hang him with the bedsheets during the night. The victim, a man known as Dean, did not die from the hanging, though. Perhaps the sheet or their nerve gave way. But undeterred, the attackers then pinned Dean to the floor, shoved his head under one of the heavy iron bedposts of the ward, and repeatedly jumped on the bed until they had crushed his skull. Definitely not a quick way to go, you can imagine. And by the time the night nurse had discovered the scene, the victim was dead in a pool of his blood, and the two perpetrators reportedly stood by, calmly, spattered with gore. Now that's a horrifying story, don't you think? Records confirm at least one patient, death by homicide in that era that fits the description too, though one struggles to fathom how such a thing could have been allowed to happen at all, but, well, it's just the way it is, isn't it? And there's another off-cited tragedy. It involves the fate of a young female nurse named Elizabeth. In the mid-1950s, Nurse Elizabeth, a surname varying in retellings, disappeared during an overnight shift. At the time, her absence was a mystery. She had been well-liked, well-respected, pretty much a friend to everyone around the time, and there was no sign of her leaving. It wasn't until about 2 months later that other staff began complaining of a foul odor seeping from a seldom-used staircase near an abandoned ward. Upon investigation, well, they found Elizabeth's decomposing body hidden at the bottom of that dark stairwell. The discovery sent shockwaves. It appeared that she had been attacked by one or more patients and her body then concealed. This incident underscored that even the staff were not safe in Weston's deteriorating environment. And in fact, the hospital employee records from the 50s and 60s mention several assaults on staff, including female attendants being assaulted by male patients, and many nurses or orderlies suffering broken bones or concussions from patient attacks. so working at Weston had become a dangerous assignment indeed, and I'm sure they weren't getting paid extra for that. As the 50s drew to a close, West Virginia's mental health system finally began to face pressure to change. The combination of public exposés, the obvious ethical problems of lobotomy, and the advent of the first effective antipsychotic medications in 1955, notably chlorpromazine, and thorazine, slowly started to stem the tide. Now, thorazine could calm psychotic patients without shackles or surgery, and as its use spread at Weston, it allowed some patients who had been unmanageable to be discharged, or at least moved to a less restrictive setting. And this marked the beginning of deinstitutionalization, although at Weston in the 1950s, it was only a trickle rather than a flood. The population did start to decline, however, from the mid-50s peak of around 2,400 patients, but thousands still remained, and conditions did not immediately improve. The hospital was by then an aging leviathan, physically crumbling and entrenched in habit. So by the 60s and 70s, broader changes in general in American society and medicine were reshaping psychiatric care. The civil rights movement and changing social attitudes cast a critical eye on institutions like Weston. New psychiatric drugs, antidepressants, improved antipsychotics, and a philosophy of more community-based care promised that many long-term patients could live outside the hospital walls. The patient population at Weston did continue to drop through the 60s, from around 1,800 in 1960 to about 1,200 in 1970. On paper, that sounds like progress, sure. Less crowding, well, it should have meant better conditions. And indeed, the state did build a modern medical center building around the Weston campus in 1960, complete with a surgery suite and a morgue, aiming to upgrade the hospital's capabilities. Restraint practices were officially toned down. Straitjackets and cage-like crib beds were phased out in favor of chemical restraints, that is, tranquilizer drugs, things like Valium, that kind of thing. However, those who remained at Weston tended to be the most severe cases, and the ones who had nowhere else to go. You see, many had spent decades institutionalized, and they had no families or community supports. So what do you do with such people? That was a challenge. And as for the funding, that was still woefully inadequate. West Virginia, a relatively poor state, struggled to support modern psychiatric services. By the late 1970s, Weston State Hospital had taken on a role partly as a forensic facility, housing insanity, equities, and violent criminals with mental illness, because other state facilities had simply closed. Now, this change actually made the environment in some wards even more dangerous, and now persons with a history of violence were intermingled with the older, chronic population. But like we said, you might have assumed that a shrinking population automatically meant improved life for patients, but investigative reports revealed that neglect and abuse persisted till the very end. In 1985, the Charleston Gazette once again turned the spotlight on Weston. Court-appointed inspectors had toured the hospital as part of a lawsuit, and their findings were horrific. Parts of the hospital were dirty and unkempt. Many patients were found completely naked, and some were still kept in cage-like enclosures or chained to furniture for lack of better means to control them. Bathrooms in certain wards were smeared with human feces and reeked of ammonia. Apparently, they had gone uncleaned for days or weeks. The kitchen was operating below health standards too, and patients were reportedly malnourished and dehydrated in some cases. This expose, coming at a time when public tolerance for such abuse was low, sparked quite a bit of outrage. How, people wondered, could a state hospital in 1985 look more like something from 1885? Good question, right? Once again, all just comes down to too many people and not enough people to take care of them. Overworked people tend to lose their patience. The 1980s also saw one of the asylum's darkest individual incidents. For example, in 1982, an elderly female patient was beaten to death by a younger patient. Tragedy that shows that continued problem of housing fragile and violent individuals together. This incident was mentioned in legislative hearings, according to the Gilchrist-Stalnaker case. Another notorious event occurred in 1987, in what was called Ward F, the maximum security ward built in the late 40s. 2 patients murdered another patient, echoing the bedpost scenario described earlier, if indeed it was not just the same event. It seems at least one patient's murder by bludgeoning happened during this era, leaving a permanent stain on the institution's record, and probably the floor. Well, meanwhile, patients who died by taking their own lives due to lack of supervision also made the headlines. The 1992 Gazette coverage noted that a patient named Brian Scott B. had hanged himself, and his body laid undiscovered for 8 days within the hospital. Another patient, George Edward Bodie, died from injuries sustained in a fight with a roommate the same year. These incidents showed that even as the institution's population dwindled, basic oversight and safety had not markedly improved. By the early 1900s, it was quite evident that Weston State Hospital, in its current form, could not continue. Advocacy groups and families of patients filed a class action lawsuit, this Humphreys versus Weston State Hospital, highlighting the constitutional rights violations of the patients. A federal judge agreed that the conditions violated the patient's right to appropriate treatment and ordered changes immediately. At the same time, West Virginia's government finally allocated funds for a new psychiatric facility. There was even a brief, bizarre plan proposed by Governor Arch Moore in 1986 to repurpose the old asylum building as a state prison, reflecting the sentiment that it was basically a prison already in the first place. Well, that plan was dropped after legal challenges. Turning a hospital into a penitentiary was deemed unconstitutional without proper due process for the patients. Instead, the state built a modern psychiatric center nearby in Weston, the William R. Sharp Jr. Hospital, which opened in 1994. Thus, in the May of 1994, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum / Weston State Hospital was officially shut down after 130 years of continuous operation. The last remaining residents, fewer than 300 by then, were either transferred to the new Sharp Hospital or released to community care homes. The closure was in part by court order, as a settlement of the lawsuit, and also a recognition that the building was beyond salvage as a functioning hospital. Decades of maltreatment and mismanagement had finally come to an end. But when the heavy front doors closed for the last time, an era of history of West Virginia closed with them. The local community around Weston, despite knowing the asylum's terrible conditions, initially felt an economic pain at the loss. You see, the hospital had been the largest employer in the area, and an economic engine. Over 400 people lost their jobs. The enormous building, once the pride of the region, now stood empty, rapidly deteriorating. And in the years immediately after 1994, the abandoned wards were left to the elements and vandals. Rain penetrated broken windows and a leaky roof, causing plaster to fall in heaps and wood floors to rot. In a notorious incident in 1999, a group of off-duty police officers were caught using the derelict asylum interior for nighttime games of paintball, leaving behind hundreds of paint splatters and further damage. Quite an embarrassment, led to a few firings. But it seems like a pretty good place to do paintball, to be honest. But then again, vandalism is not good on these old buildings. Yeah, not good at all. In any case, for a time it certainly seemed that the great building might be destined for demolition, like so many other Kirkbride Plan asylums around the country. Yet, the asylum refused to be forgotten. In 1990, a few years before its closure, the site had been designated a National Historic Landmark in recognition of its architectural significance and its place in history of the treatment of mental illness. And this designation helped spur preservation efforts. Eventually, in 2007, a private investigator purchased the entire complex from the state with an eye to restoration. And today, the asylum stands not as a treatment center, but as a museum and a tourist attraction, a place for guided historical tours in the daytime and, quite famously, ghost hunts at night. And the irony is sharp. A building once dedicated to healing the troubled now draws crowds precisely because of its troubled history. Visitors walk through the decaying halls with flashlights, hearing tales of lobotomies performed in the operating theater, or possibly encountering the eerie graffiti left by the former patients. Some rooms have been meticulously restored to their 19th century appearance, the ward of a Civil War-era patient, the office of a Victorian-era superintendent, the art therapy room with patients' crayon drawings still pinned to corkboards. Other areas are left untouched, frozen in the ruin that was found in 2007, paint peeling in long strips from the ceiling. Well, from an academic perspective, the asylum offers a case study in the trajectory of institutional care. It's an encapsulation of the arc from the reformist optimism, the belief that asylum care could cure mental illness in a humane environment, to the disillusionment of the institutional drift. The very structures meant to heal became agents of harm. The history prompts many critical reflections, that's for sure. One is how systematic factors like underfunding, social stigma, and political neglect can ultimately undermine good intentions. The asylum's founders did not intend to create a nightmare. They really did imagine a place of healing. However, patient numbers ballooned, resources lagged. The institution's priorities shifted from curing individuals to simply containing them. Overcrowding leads to neglect. Neglect leads to abuse. And sometimes abuse leads to even worse things. But there is another lesson. It's about the evolution of medical ethics. Practices like lobotomy or indefinite seclusion, which were accepted or even celebrated in their time, were seen as gross violations of human rights. The asylum's history forces us to ask, were those doctors and nurses really evil? Or were they, too, simply victims of a system and a scientific milieu that lost sight of patient humanity? Think critically about it. All those nurses, they were just being trained at the time in, well, what was the best technology they had. And you think about lobotomies too. If there was a chance to cure these patients, or at least improve conditions, well, just following orders, I suppose, isn't an excuse, but it's just the way it is, isn't it? So we can't judge them too harshly. Although, the lobotomy doctor, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be letting him off the hook. I don't know. I just don't like him. Don't like him at all. In any case, thank you very much for listening. Another insane asylum video out of the way. American history, huh? I'll admit I'm yet to visit the United States. And really I should. There's a lot of places that are on the list. A lot of these old era asylum buildings. The Alamo. Places like that. That's where I want to go to. I don't know. Maybe eventually when I go to the United States I'll do a meetup or something. Maybe. I can't make any promises for that though. Well, what I can do, though, is thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. We've got Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulford, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox, Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum? Rhonda, Carrie, Catty P, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, and Julianne. And that's it from me. Have a good night, everyone. I wish you a good rest, good health, and lots of love to you all around the world. Farewell for now.